Hello everyone, welcome back to the class of macroeconomics. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about business cycle and we will also talk a little bit about international economics. This is the last lecture of this semester's class. So to begin with, we want to talk about the topics that we are going to address today. We want to ask what is a business cycle, what are the characteristics of business cycles, what happens if we move from a closed economy to an open economy, which is the topic related to international economics. And then we will ask, when focusing on an open economy, how does economy size affect the goods market equilibrium? So the outline for today's lecture is as follows. We want to first talk about business cycles, and then we are going to talk about an open economy versus a closed economy, which is a transition from what we have learned before to a new subfield of macroeconomics, which is international economics. And then we will talk about the goods market equilibrium in an open economy, the saving and investment in a small open economy, and the saving and investment in a large open economy. So to begin with, we want to talk about business cycle. So what is business cycle? You can imagine that in the typical economy, the economy sometimes can do very well and then sometimes can do badly. So for the time the economy is doing well, for example, the farmers may face a year of good harvest. They are going to produce a lot of the fruits and then they are going to earn a lot from selling the fruits. For workers, when the economy is doing well, they probably need to work a lot so that they can produce a lot of the goods and they are going to have more incomes. For restaurants, that when the economy is doing well, then how they feel is that probably the restaurant are always fully occupied during the lunchtime and the dinner time. For taxi drivers, they may be able to see a lot of the passengers that travel around the island in Taiwan, for example. In Hsinchu, they probably need to pick up a lot of the passengers that coming for Hsinchu Science Park for business. So then they are going to face a lot of the demands for their services. So then during the time that the economy is not doing well, then things will be just the opposite. There will be few people that visiting Hsinchu for business, so the taxi driver will not that busy at all. For farmers, they may face a year of bad harvest because of the bad weather, and then they are going to have less income. For workers, they probably cannot work that many hours, but they will be able to have more leisure. But the worst case is that because the firms will not demand that many workers to work, therefore some are going to face unemployment. So then it is quite natural that the economic activities are going to face the scenario that sometimes is doing well and sometimes is doing badly. So then because of that, when we aggregated up the economic activities of a nation, we are going to see fluctuations in output, in income, in employment of a nation. For such a fluctuation, that is about the changes of the economic activities, then we call it business cycle. So for the definition of a business cycle, we say it is an economic-wide fluctuation in output, income, and unemployment, and among some other variables. And then so for a business cycle, it will follow the following pattern. A decline in the aggregated economic activity to a low point, which is called trough, followed by a recovery of the activity to a high point, which is a peak. Of course, if it is the opposite, which is a recovery of the economy from the low point to a high point, and then a decline in the aggregated economic activity to a low point, are both defined as a business cycle. Therefore, we say a complete business cycle should include both a decline and a rise in aggregated economic activities. It can be either from peak to peak or from trough to trough. So then here are a couple terminologies that we use quite a lot when we are describing business cycles. The first terminology we use a lot is called contraction or recession. These are the terms describing a decline in the aggregated economic activity. When the decline is severe, then we call it depression. Another term we use for describing business cycle is called expansion or boom. It is describing the scenario that there is a rise in the aggregated economic activity. Finally, for a business cycle, they have turning points. The top is called the peak and the bottom is called the trough. Both of them are the turning points of a business cycle. And the turning point for US is officially designated by the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee. For Taiwan, these turning points are officially designated by the National Development Council, which is called 国发会. Now let's take a look at a plot for business cycles so that we will be able to have a better idea about what does it mean for the definition of business cycles. So to begin with, given that we define a business cycle is about the fluctuation of aggregated economic activities over time, therefore in here the vertical axis we labeled it as the aggregated economic activity, and for the horizontal axis we labeled it for the time. So then the reason why the vertical axis we labeled it as the aggregated economic activity instead of output is because the business cycle is reflecting the fluctuations of aggregated economic activity, not limited to output, which is a lot of time represented by GDP, but the economic aggregated activity refer to something more than output. Therefore, in here, the vertical axis, we label it as the aggregated economic activity. So then from here, you can see that the business cycle is the fluctuations that moving up and down and up again. But then there is an overall growth trend that's going up, and we call it a normal growth path. So then we now know that for the business cycle is the fluctuation around this normal growth trend. And then for the valley of the time path, it is called the trough. The top of the hill is called the peak. When there is a movement from the trough to the peak, then it is called expansion. On the other hand, if there is a movement from the peak to the trough, we call it contraction. Therefore, the definition for a complete business cycle is that it is either the movement of the aggregated economic activity from trough to trough or from peak to peak. Under either definition, when we are looking at a complete business cycle, it will include both an expansion and a contraction. But it can be either from the bottom of the valley to another bottom of the valley, or it can be from the top of the hill to another top of the hill. So that's the definition of a complete business cycle. Now let's move on to look at the characteristics of business cycles. We say there are two characteristics. One is recurrent, the other is persistent. We claim that the business cycle is recurrent. In other words, it is not periodic. What does it mean that it is periodic? It means that it comes with a fixed interval. But the problem of the business cycle is that it can come in as short as a couple months or as long as a couple years. Therefore, even though the cycle is always there, it will be always an expansion following a contraction. But then when it is recurrent, it tells us the expansion and the contraction and expansion will continue to happen, but it will not come in a fixed interval. It will always have this pattern, but the duration of each phase is uncertain. So we claim that the characteristic of the business cycle is recurrent, not periodic. But for sure, it will come, but not in a fixed interval. The second characteristic of the business cycle is that it is persistent. When we say it is persistent, it means that a fall that we observe in a aggregated economic activity will follow by a further fall, and a rise of the aggregated economic activity will follow by a further rise. So then the prediction of the turning point is difficult. That is because we don't know when the continue of the fall of when the continued rise should stop. But once you can predict the turning point of a business cycle, then you probably will be able to make a fortune. Unfortunately, it is not that easy. So the next thing that we want to talk about is the business cycle fact. The business cycle fact we are referring to is that we want to look at the cyclical behavior of macroeconomic variables. So then when we talk about the business cycle behavior of macro variables, we want to define two terms. One is called direction, the other is called timing. So when we are talking about direction, we are talking about whether or not an economic variable moves together with business cycle. So if we move in the same direction, we call the variable procyclical. If we move in the opposite direction, we call the variable countercyclical variables. If the pattern is not clear, then we call it acyclical. On the other hand, for the timing, if the rise and fall of variables come before the turning point of the business cycle, then we call it a leading variable. If the rise and fall of the variables come at the same time as the turning point, then we call it a coincident variable. Finally, if the rise and fall of the variables come after the turning point of the business cycle, then we call it a lagging variable. So then, for example, if an economy is in expansion, then it means that the business cycle is from the trough to the peak. Then for the variables that is increased value during this phase, then we call it a procyclical variable. The examples for procyclical variables are GDP and consumption. So then given that unemployment rate falls during an expansion, therefore it is a countercyclical variable because the direction of the change for the variable is the opposite of the business cycle. Finally, the example for the acyclical variable is the real interest rate, and we will explain that later. In terms of the timing, we argue that the stock price and investment are leading variables, and then the coincident variable is the GDP and consumption, and that is why a lot of time we use the GDP to approximate the business cycle. But in fact, when we want to draw business cycle, we need to plot the fluctuation of the aggregated economic activities instead of GDP. Finally, the lagging variable is inflation and nominal interest rate. So what I want to do next is that I want to show you a table from our textbook. This table is very useful in helping you identify which variable is procyclical, countercyclical, acyclical, as well as leading, coincident, and lagging.